Sometimes the person who saves your life is the one who has already lived far longer than history remembers. Emma Carter glanced at the glowing clock above the downtown bus terminal. As the numbers rolled to 11:48 p.m., her shift had ended almost an hour late, thanks to 2 coworkers calling in sick and a broken coffee machine that somehow became everyone else's emergency. Her feet ached inside worn sneakers that had survived one winter too many, and the paper envelope holding her tips felt painfully light in her jacket pocket. $43.17. Not enough to cover the overdue electric bill waiting on her tiny kitchen table. She pulled her thin coat tighter as a cold October wind swept through the nearly empty station. The last Route 17 bus hissed to a stop, its tired engine sounding almost as exhausted as she felt. Missing this ride meant walking nearly 7 miles through unfamiliar streets, something no one wanted to do after midnight. Emma climbed aboard with a quiet smile for the driver and dropped her fare into the machine. Only 6 other passengers occupied the bus, each wrapped inside their own silent world. A college student wearing oversized headphones, an elderly couple holding hands, a delivery worker asleep against the window, a woman reading from a tablet, 2 men dressed in expensive charcoal coats who never once looked at their phones. Emma settled into a seat halfway down the aisle and rested her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the city drifted by beneath amber streetlights, rain from earlier in the evening leaving every sidewalk shining like polished stone. She closed her eyes for only a second. At least that was what she told herself. The bus stopped 3 blocks later. Someone stepped aboard. Emma barely noticed at first. She simply felt it. The atmosphere changed so subtly that it escaped explanation. Conversations that had already been quiet became completely silent. Even the driver straightened slightly in his seat. The newcomer walked toward the rear with calm, measured footsteps that never hurried yet somehow reached the empty seat across from Emma almost instantly. He wore a black overcoat tailored with impossible precision, dark gloves, and a charcoal scarf that framed a face so striking it almost seemed carved rather than born. His skin carried the pale elegance of marble beneath moonlight, his dark hair perfectly still despite the draft entering each time the doors opened. He looked no older than 30. Yet there was something in his silver-gray eyes that belonged to another century. Lucian Ashford lowered himself into the seat without making a sound. He glanced once toward the rain-speckled window before returning his gaze to the sleeping city. No one recognized him. That was precisely how he preferred it. For 300 years, he had crossed countless kingdoms beneath countless names. Tonight he wore another ordinary face among ordinary people. Yet nothing about him was ordinary. As the bus rolled deeper into the night, Emma fought to keep her eyes open. Her double shift, skipped dinner, and lingering fever from the previous week pressed against her like invisible weights. She blinked hard, trying to focus on the passing lights outside, but they stretched into blurred ribbons of gold. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders relaxed. She never noticed her body leaning farther toward the aisle with every gentle turn of the bus. Across from her, Lucian remained perfectly still. Then something reached him. Not a sound. Not a scent. Something older. Something buried beneath centuries of forgotten promises. His eyes lifted from the floor and settled on Emma with quiet curiosity. For the first time in generations, the ancient silence inside his immortal heart shifted ever so slightly, like the first crack appearing across the surface of a frozen lake. He frowned almost imperceptibly. Impossible, he thought. Yet he could not look away. Outside, thunder murmured beyond the skyline as the bus climbed onto the elevated bridge overlooking the sleeping river. The driver eased around a wide curve. Emma's exhausted body finally surrendered. Her balance slipped. Her head tipped sideways toward the cold steel safety rail beside the window, falling faster than anyone nearby could react. Lucian moved before anyone realized she was falling. His gloved hand slipped between Emma and the polished steel rail with impossible precision, gently cradling the back of her head only an inch before it could strike the cold metal. The motion was so smooth that it seemed less like a reaction, and more like he had known the moment would happen long before it began. The elderly couple exchanged puzzled glances. The driver, watching through the overhead mirror, only saw a gentleman catching an exhausted passenger before she slumped too far. Emma never opened her eyes. Her breathing remained slow and uneven as though every ounce of strength had been drained from her long before she boarded the bus. Lucian studied her face in silence. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance at first glance. A faded jacket, calloused hands marked by countless hours of honest work, dark circles beneath tired eyes that spoke of responsibilities carried alone. Yet beneath all of that, he sensed something that should not have existed. It was faint, almost hidden beneath layers of ordinary human life, but it pulsed with an ancient familiarity that disturbed centuries of perfect control. His immortal heart answered with another quiet beat. Once, then again. Across the aisle, one of the men in charcoal coats slowly lifted his eyes. His expression did not change, but his fingers tightened around the leather briefcase resting on his lap. Beside him, the second man gave the smallest nod without looking away from the rain outside. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. They had both witnessed the impossible. Lucian felt them watching. Without turning his head, he spoke in a calm voice barely louder than a whisper. "Continue your journey." The words sounded ordinary, yet something inside them carried undeniable authority. The two men immediately looked away as though the thought of questioning him had never entered their minds. Emma shifted slightly, her forehead brushing against the sleeve of Lucian's coat. A quiet sigh escaped her lips. "I am sorry," she murmured in her sleep. "I did not mean to fall asleep at work." Lucian remained perfectly still. She was not speaking to him. She was trapped somewhere between exhaustion and dreams, apologizing to someone who was not. Even there, a strange feeling settled over him. He had ruled kingdoms, signed treaties that shaped centuries, watched entire cities rise and disappear beneath time. Yet the quiet apology of an overworked young woman reached places inside him that power never had. Outside, the skyline faded behind sheets of mist as the bus crossed the river bridge. Reflections shimmered across the windows like moving ghosts. For a brief instant Lucian caught his own outline in the glass. Beside it appeared Emma's reflection, peaceful despite her exhaustion. He frowned. His own image should not have appeared at all. It vanished almost immediately, leaving only hers behind. Another impossibility. The bus rolled onward. The driver announced the next stop, but nobody moved. Even the usual sounds of late-night travel seemed strangely distant. Lucian carefully adjusted Emma, so her head rested against the padded seat instead of the narrow rail. His movements were gentle enough not to wake her. As he withdrew his hand, his fingertips brushed the inside of her wrist. Warmth spread through the contact, subtle but unmistakable. Beneath her sleeve, hidden from every human eye, a faint silver pattern flickered for less than a heartbeat before disappearing again. Lucian's expression hardened. He had seen that symbol only once before, preserved within forgotten records locked beneath the oldest chamber of his kingdom. It belonged to a bloodline believed to have vanished generations ago. Impossible, he thought again. Yet impossible things had now happened 3 times within a single bus ride. Ahead, the city lights grew brighter as the Route 17 approached downtown once more. Somewhere beyond the rain, unseen eyes had already begun following the bus. And for the first time in centuries, Vampire King Lucian Ashford realized that tonight was never an accident. Emma slowly opened her eyes as the bus glided away from the bridge, the steady hum of the engine replacing the strange silence that had wrapped itself around her dreams. For several seconds she could not remember where she was. The overhead lights blurred into soft circles, and every muscle in her body felt unusually heavy. Then, reality returned all at once. The late shift. The last bus. Rent due in 4 days. She blinked several times before realizing she was no longer leaning toward the steel rail. Instead, she was resting comfortably against the padded seat. Confused, she straightened herself immediately. "I am so sorry," she said quietly, brushing loose strands of brown hair away from her face. "I must have fallen asleep." Across from her, the man in the black overcoat simply inclined his head. "You looked exhausted," he replied. His voice was calm, deep, and impossibly composed, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to raise it in order to be heard. Emma offered an embarrassed smile. "That obvious? Only to someone who notices." She let out a nervous laugh before looking toward the rain-covered windows. "3 jobs will do that, I guess." The words escaped before she intended to share them. She usually avoided talking about her life with strangers, but something about this man felt strangely reassuring despite the mystery surrounding him. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not offer empty sympathy. He simply listened. "You should rest more," he said after a brief silence. Emma smiled again, this time with quiet sadness. Rest is expensive these days. Those simple words lingered between them. Lucian looked out at the passing streets, but his thoughts remained fixed on the woman sitting across from him. She spoke without bitterness, without resentment. Even now, carrying burdens that would have broken many others, she still thanked strangers and apologized for inconveniencing people she had never met. He had spent centuries watching kings demand more than they deserved. Yet this young woman apologized simply for closing her eyes after an impossible day. The bus slowed as it approached another stop. The doors opened with a soft hiss. Nobody boarded. Nobody stepped off. Outside, a black luxury sedan remained parked beneath a flickering street lamp. Its windows were tinted so dark they reflected nothing. As the bus pulled away again, the sedan eased into traffic several car lengths behind. Inside the vehicle, a pale woman dressed in charcoal gray studied the bus through the windshield. "Confirmation?" asked the driver without taking his eyes off the road. She lowered a small silver lens that shimmered with an unnatural glow. The signal appeared exactly as described. The king. He has already found her. Silence filled the sedan. After several moments, the driver spoke again. "Do we report to the council?" The woman looked back toward the bus, her expression unreadable. "No. Not yet. If the council learns the silver bloodline has resurfaced before His Majesty understands what she truly is, every ancient house will begin hunting her before sunrise." The sedan quietly continued its pursuit through the sleeping city. Back on the bus, Emma rubbed her hands together, suddenly aware of the cold. Lucian noticed before she said anything. Without a word, he removed the dark scarf from around his neck and gently offered it across the aisle. Emma immediately shook her head. "No, I could not possibly take that. You are shivering." "I will be fine." "You are trying to convince yourself." She hesitated before accepting it with both hands. The fabric felt warmer than it should have, carrying a faint scent of cedar and winter air. "Thank you," she whispered. The moment the scarf settled around her shoulders, a barely visible silver light flickered beneath the edge of the fabric before disappearing into the night. Neither the driver nor the remaining passengers noticed, but Lucian did. And somewhere behind them, inside the following sedan, the woman quietly closed her eyes. "It has begun," she whispered. "The old prophecy is waking once again." Emma wrapped the scarf a little tighter around her shoulders, surprised by how quickly the warmth spread through her chilled body. It felt unlike any fabric she had ever touched, soft yet strangely comforting, as though it had somehow captured the heat of a quiet fireplace despite the cold October night outside. She looked up at Lucian with genuine gratitude. "I will return this before I leave." He met her eyes for only a moment. "Keep it until you no longer need it." She smiled politely. People do not usually trust strangers that much. A faint expression crossed his face, almost resembling a smile before disappearing again. "Perhaps they should." Emma glanced toward the rain streaking across the windows. "Or perhaps I have been lucky tonight." Before Lucian could answer, every light inside the bus flickered once. Then again. The engine continued humming, but the cabin briefly dimmed into an uneasy twilight. Several passengers instinctively looked around. The elderly woman tightened her grip on her husband's hand. The college student removed one headphone and frowned toward the ceiling. The driver tapped the dashboard. "That is strange," he muttered under his breath. "Electrical system passed inspection this morning." For everyone else, it seemed like an ordinary mechanical problem. For Lucian, it was something entirely different. He slowly turned his attention toward the rear emergency exit. The glass reflected nothing unusual to human eyes. Yet hidden within the darkness beyond the windows, he sensed familiar presences moving alongside the bus with impossible speed. They remained concealed between shadows cast by bridges and abandoned buildings, matching the vehicle mile after mile without making a sound. Someone had already discovered Emma, earlier than he had expected. Across town, inside the black sedan, The pale woman quietly lowered the silver lens once more. The ancient markings engraved around its edge glowed faintly before fading. "The Vale walkers have arrived," she said softly. The driver tightened both hands on the steering wheel. They should not have sensed her this quickly. Neither should the king. She watched the bus continue through the rain. Everything that should have remained asleep is beginning to awaken. Back inside the bus, Emma rubbed her temples. A dull ache had settled behind her eyes. "Are you feeling unwell?" Lucian asked. "Only tired." She hesitated before continuing. "Actually, something feels different." "Different how?" She searched for the right words. "Almost like someone is watching me." Her eyes drifted toward the dark windows. "It is probably my imagination." Lucian remained silent. It was not her imagination. Human instincts often notice danger long before human minds accept it. Another flash passed through the cabin as the overhead lights dimmed for a second time. This time the temperature dropped noticeably. The windows fogged from the edges inward, delicate frost spreading across the glass despite the mild autumn weather. The driver frowned. That should not be happening. One passenger quietly zipped his jacket higher. Another rubbed warmth into her hands. Emma looked down at the scarf around her shoulders. Unlike the rest of the bus, she still felt comfortably warm. "This scarf is incredible," she said with a grateful laugh. "It is almost like it knows I was cold." Lucian looked away before answering. "Perhaps it does." She laughed again, assuming he was joking. He was not. The scarf had once belonged to someone who had protected an entire kingdom, simply through kindness rather than power. It had remained preserved for generations inside the royal archives until Lucian chose to wear it earlier that evening for reasons he himself could not explain. Now it rested around Emma's shoulders as though it had always belonged there. The bus announced the next stop. Emma gathered her small backpack and stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her jacket. "This is my stop," she said. "Thank you. For everything." Lucian rose as well. "I will walk with you." Emma looked surprised. "You do not have to." "I know." Before she could question him further, the bus doors folded open with a soft hiss. Rain drifted through the entrance on a cold midnight breeze. Emma stepped onto the nearly empty sidewalk beneath a flickering streetlight. Lucian followed one pace behind. Neither of them noticed that across the intersection, 3 silent figures had already emerged from the shadows, watching without blinking as the last night bus disappeared into the darkness. The rain had softened into a quiet mist that drifted beneath the streetlights, wrapping the nearly empty sidewalks in a pale silver glow. Emma adjusted the backpack on her shoulder and looked around the quiet neighborhood. "You really do not have to walk me home," she said once more. "It is only another 6 blocks. Lucian matched her pace without hesitation. "Then 6 blocks is not very far." She smiled to herself. "You are unusually stubborn for someone I just met. I have been told that before." She laughed softly, the sound light enough to break through the silence surrounding them. For reasons she could not explain, the uneasy feeling that had followed her since the bus ride began to fade whenever he walked beside her. The city itself seemed quieter than usual. The distant traffic had almost disappeared. Even the usual late-night sounds of sirens and passing trains felt strangely absent. Only the steady rhythm of their footsteps echoed across the wet pavement. They turned onto a narrower street lined with old brick apartment buildings and closed neighborhood shops. Emma pointed ahead toward a small corner bakery with faded blue awnings. "That place opens at 5 every morning. Sometimes they give me yesterday's bread for half price." Lucian glanced toward the dark storefront. "The owner is kind." Emma looked surprised. "You know him." "I know people who continue choosing kindness, even when life gives them reasons not to." She looked at him curiously. "You speak like someone much older than you look." For the briefest moment, Lucian almost answered honestly. Instead, he simply said, "Appearances are rarely complete." Before Emma could ask another question, every streetlight along the block flickered at exactly the same moment. One after another, they dimmed until only a faint glow remained. The air grew noticeably colder. Emma instinctively stopped walking. "Did the power go out?" she asked quietly. Lucian did not answer immediately. His attention had already shifted toward the rooftops overlooking the street. 3 motionless figures stood above the old buildings, almost impossible to distinguish from the darkness itself. Their long coats moved gently in the night breeze, yet none of them seemed affected by the rain. Human eyes would have mistaken them for ordinary shadows. Lucian knew better. They had found them. Across the street, a parked delivery van suddenly reflected 3 pairs of pale eyes in its side mirror. Then the reflection vanished as though it had never existed. Emma noticed only the movement. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "Stay close to me," Lucian replied calmly. She looked at him, confused by the quiet certainty in his voice. "Is something wrong? Someone is watching." Before fear could settle into her thoughts, a familiar black sedan slowly turned the corner and rolled to a gentle stop several yards ahead. The pale woman stepped out holding a closed black umbrella even though the rain had nearly stopped. She inclined her head respectfully toward Lucian before speaking. "Your Majesty." Emma froze. She looked from the elegant woman to Lucian, certain she had misheard. "Your what?" The woman immediately realized Emma was still unaware. Her expression shifted ever so slightly. "Forgive me." Lucian never took his eyes off the rooftops. "Report. The Vale Walkers have surrounded this district. They have not attacked." "Not yet," Lucian answered. The woman nodded. "They are waiting for permission from the ancient council." Emma stared at both of them in complete silence. None of the conversation made any sense. "Majesty. Council. Vale Walkers." It sounded less like reality and more like the fantasy novels she borrowed from the public library, whenever she could not afford new books. She looked back toward Lucian. The calm stranger from the bus was gone. Although he had not changed his posture, something about him now felt vastly different. Older. Stronger. The quiet authority in his voice no longer sounded unusual. It sounded natural. Then from somewhere high above the sleeping street, a single clear voice drifted through the night. "After 300 years, the silver bloodline has finally returned." Emma slowly turned toward the sound, unable to see who had spoken. But Lucian already knew. The night that had begun with an exhausted waitress boarding the last bus home had quietly become the first chapter of a destiny hidden for centuries. Emma stood perfectly still as the words echoed through the empty street. The silver bloodline. She had never heard the phrase before. Yet the moment it reached her ears, an unfamiliar chill traveled through her chest. She looked from the rooftops back to Lucian, searching his face for some sign that this was all an elaborate misunderstanding. "What is happening?" she asked quietly. "Who are these people?" Lucian held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "People who believe your life became important tonight." Emma let out a nervous laugh. "I work double shifts at a neighborhood diner. My landlord leaves overdue notices on my door every month. Nobody has ever considered my life important. That does not make them correct." Before she could respond, the pale woman stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Your Majesty, the council will arrive before dawn if they continue tracking the awakening." Lucian remained calm. "Then they will arrive. They will demand custody of her. They may demand whatever they wish." The woman hesitated. "You know the ancient law." "I also know who wrote it." Emma stared at both of them, growing more confused with every sentence. "Would someone please explain what any of this means?" Lucian turned toward her. For the first time that evening, the distance between them felt smaller, not because he had stepped closer, but because his expression carried something almost human. "Emma, I am about to tell you something that will sound impossible." She folded her arms against the cold. "After tonight, impossible seems to be becoming a pattern." A faint smile appeared in his eyes before fading again. "There is a world that exists beside yours. Most people never see it. They live their entire lives believing every unusual story is only a legend." Emma searched his face, expecting the punchline that never came. "You are serious?" "Completely." She looked toward the woman in gray. "And she called you Your Majesty." Lucian gave a single quiet nod. "Because I am the king of that hidden world." Emma blinked once, then twice. She waited for herself to wake up, convinced she had finally collapsed from exhaustion somewhere on the bus. She pinched the inside of her hand. It hurt. The rain still smelled like wet pavement. The cold still touched her face. Nothing changed. "You are telling me." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Lucian completed it for her. I am what your world would call a vampire. Silence settled over the street. Strangely, Emma did not scream. She did not run. She simply looked at him with the same thoughtful expression she had worn while talking to him on the bus. Finally she asked, "Is that why your hands felt so cold?" Even Lucian seemed caught off guard by the question. The woman in gray lowered her eyes, almost hiding a smile. "Yes," Lucian answered honestly. Emma considered that for several seconds before nodding slowly. "That explains more than I expected." She looked at him again. "You caught me before I got hurt. You walked me home because you thought someone was following me. You gave me your scarf when I was cold. None of those things sound frightening." Lucian remained silent. She continued softly, "Maybe I should judge people by what they choose to do instead of what they are called." Those simple words landed with unexpected weight. The pale woman looked away toward the rooftops, knowing few people would have spoken so calmly after hearing such a revelation. High above them, the hidden observers remained motionless. They had expected panic. Instead they witnessed compassion. One of the figures whispered into the darkness, "She carries the blood exactly as the prophecy described." Lucian heard every word. His eyes lifted toward the silent skyline as a distant church bell rang midnight. The night was no longer protecting Emma from the hidden world. It had just introduced her to it, and somewhere beyond the sleeping city, ancient powers were already changing their course because an ordinary waitress had chosen kindness over fear. Emma looked down the quiet street toward the aging apartment building she had called home for almost 3 years. The familiar brick walls, the flickering security light above the entrance, and the tiny flower pot one of her elderly neighbors always kept beside the front steps suddenly seemed like pieces of another life. Less than an hour earlier, her greatest concern had been stretching $43 until payday. Now a man who claimed to be a vampire king stood beside her while unseen figures watched from the rooftops. None of it should have made sense. Yet somehow, standing beside Lucian, reality felt stranger than any story she had ever read. And still more believable than pretending none of it was happening. "If everything you told me is true," Emma said quietly, "then why me?" Lucian answered without hesitation, "That is the question I intend to discover." She studied his face. "You honestly do not know?" "I know only that something ancient recognized you before either of us understood why." Emma looked at the scarf resting around her shoulders. "I have never done anything extraordinary. I grew up in Ohio. My father repaired heating systems. My mother worked at the public library until she became ill. After they passed away, I simply tried to keep moving forward." She smiled sadly. "There is nothing magical about overdue bills and double shifts." Lucian listened carefully, noticing how she spoke about hardship without anger. It reminded him of people he had known centuries ago. Those rare souls who measured wealth by compassion rather than possessions. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the rarest things spend their entire lives believing they are ordinary." Before Emma could answer, the woman in gray touched a small crystal suspended from a silver chain around her wrist. Its pale glow brightened for only a moment before fading again. Her expression immediately grew serious. "Your Majesty, another signal has appeared." Lucian turned toward her. "Distance. Less than 1 mile. How many?" "At least 7 signatures." Emma frowned. "Signatures. Not written ones," the woman explained gently. "Every ancient vampire house carries a distinct presence. Those who have awakened tonight belong to different families." Emma slowly realized what that meant. "They are all coming here. Because of me?" Neither Lucian nor the woman answered immediately. Their silence became the answer. A cool breeze drifted through the narrow street, carrying the scent of rain and cedar. High above, clouds slowly parted, allowing pale moonlight to spill across the rooftops. As the silver light touched Emma's face, something unexpected happened. Tiny shimmering patterns appeared for an instant across the surface of the scarf before dissolving into the fabric like frost, disappearing beneath morning sunlight. Emma looked down in surprise. "Did you see that?" Lucian had seen every detail. The ancient symbols woven into the scarf had remained dormant for over 200 years. They responded now only because Emma was wearing it. The realization settled heavily in his mind. This was no coincidence. The relic itself had acknowledged her. Somewhere overhead, one of the hidden observers whispered in astonishment, "The royal heirloom accepted her." Another voice answered quietly, "No human should be able to awaken those markings." Lucian stepped slightly closer to Emma, placing himself naturally between her and the surrounding rooftops. He did not raise his voice. He did not issue threats. Yet when he spoke, every hidden watcher heard him clearly. "No one approaches her without my permission." The night itself seemed to pause. Even the wind grew still. One by one, the unseen presences withdrew farther into the darkness, not because they had abandoned their interest, but because none of them wished to challenge the authority carried within those calm words. Emma noticed only the sudden return of silence. She looked at Lucian with growing curiosity. "People really listen to you." He met her eyes. "Most of the time." She smiled. "I think I am beginning to understand why." For the first time in centuries, Lucian found himself hoping that the dangerous truth surrounding Emma would not change the kindness already shining within her. But deep beneath the oldest halls of his hidden kingdom, ancient records had already begun revealing names long forgotten, and at the very top of a weathered parchment, illuminated by a single silver flame, one name slowly emerged from the faded ink. Emma Carter. Emma stared at her own name as though the ancient parchment had somehow reached across time and spoken directly to her. "That cannot be possible," she whispered. "There has to be another Emma Carter." The pale woman standing beside Lucian lowered her eyes respectfully. "There has never been another recorded within the royal archives." Emma slowly shook her head. "I have never even left the country." Lucian watched her carefully. History has never required distance. Sometimes it waits quietly inside a single family until the right moment arrives. Emma folded her arms, trying to steady her thoughts. Every answer seemed to create two more questions. If my family was connected to all of this, why did nobody ever tell me? Lucian looked toward the moonlit clouds drifting above the city. "Perhaps they believed silence would protect you." Before either of them could continue, the crystal hanging from the woman's wrist brightened once again. This time it did not fade. Its silver light remained constant. She inhaled slowly. "They have entered the district." The temperature seemed to fall another few degrees. The quiet neighborhood remained unchanged to ordinary eyes. Apartment windows still glowed warmly. A distant television flickered behind half-closed curtains. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once before falling strangely silent. Yet beneath that ordinary midnight scene, an invisible current had begun moving through the streets. Lucian stepped forward until he stood directly beside Emma. "You must leave this place tonight." She looked at the familiar apartment entrance only a few yards away. "My home is right there." "It is no longer the safest place for you." Emma hesitated. "Everything I own is inside. Things can be replaced." She smiled faintly despite everything. "That is easier to say when you actually own things worth replacing." Lucian almost smiled in return. Even now, surrounded by uncertainty, she still found room for gentle humor. It reminded him why kindness possessed a strength that power alone could never command. The woman in gray opened the rear door of the waiting sedan. "Your Majesty, the estate has already been prepared." Emma looked from the car back to her apartment building. Through one of the second-floor windows she noticed Mrs. Harper, her elderly neighbor, watering the small plants she insisted on keeping alive year-round. The familiar sight tightened Emma's heart. "She worries if I come home late," Emma said softly. "I cannot disappear without saying anything." Lucian considered her words before giving a quiet nod. "Then leave her a message." Emma quickly removed a small notebook from her backpack, tore out a page and wrote a simple note, explaining that work had unexpectedly required her to stay elsewhere for a few days. She folded it carefully and slipped it beneath Mrs. Harper's flower pot beside the entrance where it would be found first thing in the morning. As she stepped back, a gentle breeze lifted the edge of the paper before letting it settle again. Lucian watched silently. Even when facing the unknown, Emma's first thought had been to spare someone else unnecessary worry. The ancient stories had described the silver bloodline as compassionate beyond reason. He was beginning to understand why. Suddenly, from somewhere far beyond the rooftops, the deep sound of a bronze bell rolled across the sleeping city. Once, then a second time, the woman in gray looked toward the eastern skyline. "The council has crossed the boundary." Lucian's expression became unreadable. Earlier than expected. They will demand an audience before sunrise. Emma looked between them. Will they believe me if I tell them I never asked for any of this? Lucian answered honestly. Some will. Others will see only what your blood represents. Emma lowered her eyes for a moment before lifting them again with quiet determination. Then I suppose I should find out why complete strangers think my life matters so much. Lucian opened the car door for her with calm courtesy. As Emma stepped inside, the scarf resting around her shoulders shimmered once beneath the moonlight. Hidden deep below the oldest cathedral in the kingdom, another forgotten chamber unlocked itself for the first time in 300 years, as though the ancient world had finally recognized that its long-awaited guest had accepted the first step toward her destiny. The black sedan moved silently through rain-washed streets as the city slowly disappeared behind them. Emma watched familiar neighborhoods give way to quiet tree-lined roads she had never traveled before. Storefronts became stone walls. Apartment buildings gave way to ancient iron gates wrapped in climbing ivy. Every mile carried her farther from the ordinary life she had known only hours earlier. She rested her hand against the window, watching droplets race across the glass. If I decide this is too much, she asked softly, can I still go back? Lucian sat across from her inside the spacious cabin, his calm expression unchanged. If that is truly your choice, I will personally make certain you return safely. Emma looked at him carefully. Even if everyone else disagrees? Especially then. She believed him. It surprised her how easily she did. The gates ahead opened without anyone touching them. Beyond them stretched an estate unlike anything Emma had ever imagined. Ancient limestone buildings stood beneath towering oak trees whose branches seemed older than the city itself. Warm lights glowed through tall windows, reflecting across peaceful gardens where fountains continued flowing despite the late hour. The place felt less like a fortress and more like a forgotten chapter of history preserved in perfect silence. The sedan rolled to a gentle stop beneath a covered entrance. Several attendants dressed in elegant dark clothing waited quietly, bowing respectfully as Lucian stepped out. None of them looked at Emma with fear or suspicion. Instead, each greeted her with the same courtesy they offered their king. Emma hesitated before leaving the car. They already know who I am? Lucian answered honestly. They know only that you are under my protection. Those words carried unexpected comfort. As Emma followed him through enormous carved wooden doors, she found herself surrounded by soaring ceilings, polished marble floors, and paintings that seemed centuries old. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across the entrance hall, replacing every shadow with quiet elegance. It was breathtaking, yet strangely peaceful. One elderly attendant approached with a gentle smile. Miss Carter, your room has been prepared. We hope you will find everything comfortable. Emma blinked in surprise. You already knew I was coming? The attendant exchanged a respectful glance with Lucian. His Majesty rarely asks us to prepare the East guest suite. Tonight he did. Lucian looked away almost thoughtfully. Something told me it would be needed. Emma smiled softly. I am beginning to think you trust your instincts more than most people trust facts. Centuries have taught me they often deserve it. Before they could continue, the great doors behind them slowly opened once again. A group of elegantly dressed men and women entered without speaking. Their clothing reflected different eras of history, yet each carried the same quiet dignity. Emma instinctively realized these were the council members she had heard about. The eldest among them stepped forward, his silver hair resting neatly across his shoulders. He studied Emma with thoughtful eyes before turning toward Lucian. Your Majesty, he said respectfully, the ancient records have completed their search. Lucian remained composed. And the elder opened a weathered leather book. There is no uncertainty. Emma Carter is the final living descendant of the silver bloodline. A profound silence filled the hall. Emma lowered her eyes, still struggling to understand how an ordinary waitress had become part of a story centuries in the making. Then something unexpected happened. As she instinctively reached for balance, her fingertips lightly brushed the back of Lucian's hand. A circle of soft silver light blossomed beneath their hands, spreading across the marble floor in delicate patterns that resembled ancient stars. Every member of the council immediately lowered their heads in silent respect. No command had been spoken. No ceremony had begun. The light itself had answered the touch. Emma quickly pulled her hand away in surprise. "I am sorry. I did not mean to." "You have nothing to apologize for," Lucian said quietly, his eyes never leaving the fading silver glow. For the first time in centuries, even the ancient king sounded genuinely amazed. Outside, dawn had not yet arrived, but somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, the first hint of morning waited patiently. Emma had boarded the last night bus believing she was simply trying to make it home after another exhausting shift. Instead, she had unknowingly stepped into a destiny older than memory itself, proving that sometimes the greatest power in any world begins with nothing more than an ordinary heart that never stopped choosing kindness.